Thank you to the BSA for inviting me and Val and Catherine to be part of the members only event. The film that we're going to be viewing and then discussing with filmmaker Catherine, it's called The Sociologist's Wife, and it's one of outcome from a research project that Val and I have been working on for a few years now. We wanted to tell you something about the project as a whole to set the context for the film. So the research that is behind it is exploring, it's quite crucial but unacknowledged domestic, social, administrative, and especially intellectual research and writing contributions of sociologists' wives to their influential husbands' work and careers. And our research began as a British Academy Leverhulme small grant that was focused on the analysis of two fieldwork diaries kept by two wives, Phyllis Wilmot and Pat Marston. And they kept those while their husbands, Peter Wilmot and Dennis Marston, were engaged in what were pioneering British studies that actually set the foundation for post-war sociological understanding of community and social change. So while the husbands appeared to produce insights on their own, in practice, that was propped up by insights and input from the wives. So if we have the next slide, please. Thanks. So we began the project in 2017, and as we started it, the hashtag thanks for typing, that began trending on what was then Twitter, and you have screenshots of book acknowledgement pages that were posted under the hashtag. They overwhelmingly involved male authors thanking their wives, and that was often for undertaking quite a lot more than the typing contribution of the hashtag. One of the favourites, if that's the right word, is the lower middle one on the slide here from a 1992 book. It involves sincere thanks to the first wife, who actually came up with the theory that's the backbone of his book, and a profound debt expressed to the second wife, who seems to have basically written the book with the merit of never getting headaches. And looking at the tweeted examples, you have this whole field of women's domestic and research labour that's coalescing into visibility. And the screenshots alert us to how the invisible work of academic wives in the past helped to build the careers of male academics, but also helped to establish expectations around the amount of research and teaching and admin work that's expected of academics through to today, with or without wives or partners doing any of it. So the thanks for typing contributions, they prompted Val and me to move beyond our two intended diary case studies to consider the wives of other influential male sociologists. So next slide, please. So on this slide, we have some indicative extracts from acknowledgement pages from some major male sociologist books. Their wives weren't noted as co-authors. So you have C. Wright Mill's first wife, Dorothy, also known as Freya. She typed and edited all his work during their marriage. And the top acknowledgement extract here relates to his second wife, Ruth Harper, who spent substantial time working on his new Men of Power book. And she was also involved in White Collar and the Power Elite. And their daughter recalls her mother providing the statistical underpinning for his work and helping Wright Mills to develop his arguments. In other words, research and intellectual input. The acknowledgement from Goffman's presentation of self in the middle right extract says that without his wife's collaboration, the book wouldn't have existed. And with that brief reference to collaboration, that sort of indicates a bit more than just some typing. Peter Townsend's book, The Last Refuge, is dedicated to Ruth. And in the extract on the bottom left here, his wife, Ruth Townsend, is referred to as one of four people without whom the book would not be possible. So Ruth isn't named there, she's just noted as my wife. And Ruth is also credited in Peter Townsend and Brian Reese's book, The Personal, Family and Social Circumstances of Old People. And she conducted interviews for Peter's pilot study for what was to become a large cross-national study of the elderly. And we'd also point you towards Chris Rennick's article on Ruth and Peter Townsend's family life, which shows just how integral she was to his career. Kay Titmuss, Richard Titmuss's wife, typed and edited his work as the more literate of the two, and Kay did some research work for Richard. And certainly Richard's early career benefited from Kay's cultural and social capital. Ultimately, though, their daughter, Anne Oakley, feels that Kay was frustrated by an inability to contribute her own experiences of social welfare work and to play an intellectual role in Richard's career. Dorothy Sinfield undertook research interviews for Adrian Sinfield, and in the extract on the bottom right, that's from an acknowledgement of one of his later publications, he notes that she had read and commented on the majority of his written pieces. Sheila Jackson Abrams, who's one of the wives in our film, in the middle left acknowledgement extract, she's recognised as contributing fieldwork, writing up and encouragement. She's acknowledged by her first husband, Brian Jackson, in his book, Working Class Community. Sheila had the idea for her second husband, Philip Abrams' study, Commune, Sociology and Society. She did the interviewing and participant observation. She analysed questionnaires and she took part in team meetings. She is at least credited as a author this time. And Sheila was also formative in Philip Abrams' neighbouring research, and she undertook the fieldwork for the detailed case studies, as Martin Bulmer notes in his introduction to the resulting book. We also have book acknowledgements from their husbands from Phyllis Wilmot and Pat Marsden, who, in addition to Sheila, are featured in the Sociologist film. We are going to look at Phyllis and Pat in a bit more depth in the rest of this review of our research, because their diaries allow us a more detailed glimpse of how their contributions fed through into their husband's work and shaped the post-war foundations of the discipline of sociology. So next slide, please. Now, there has been some feminist attention to wives who play a significant role in their husband's employment. So, for example, in her book, 1983 book, Married to the Job, Janet Finch uses the term incorporation. And more recently, in Forgotten Wives, Anne Oakley argues that wifehood remains a political filter of gendered assumptions about what wives do, a filter that makes that sort of subterranean industry of wifely labour so unremarkable that it isn't recognised as there at all. And looking specifically at research on the incorporated labour of academic wives, Martha Folkes and Shirley Ardner's work respectively identifies the way that they nurtured and sustained their husband's career and relationship, including hosting university dinners and hosting visiting academics. And Jennifer Platt's book on the realities of social research in the 70s, that moves us on to a sort of form of professionalization of academics' family life. It indicates that social researchers' wives were research assistants. They help helping with typing, routine stats tests, assisting husbands who were doing participant observation and so on. But as the thanks for typing Twitter posts and the book acknowledgements indicate, and as we'll show in our discussion of Phyllis and Pat's diaries, the wives were doing more than merely assisting. So we have the next slide, please. So Phyllis Wilmot is the wife of Peter Wilmot, and Pat Marsden, wife of Dennis Marsden. They kept their diaries while their husbands were undertaking intensive community studies in poor working class neighbourhoods. Phyllis Wilmot kept her diary during 1954 and 55. That's while she and her husband and their children lived in Bethnal Green, East London. And Peter Wilmot and Michael Young were undertaking their renowned family and kinship in East London study. And Phyllis also wrote a retrospective commentary on her diary in 2001. Pat Marsden's record of daily life for mothers and children on a slum clearance estate, she kept that while Dennis Marsden was undertaking his Salford slum and rehousing ethnographic study, and Pat and Dennis and their two young children lived on the estate during 1963. And we interviewed Pat Marsden in 2009 about her memories of the time. The sociologist wives' diaries were kept in a post-war Britain that was seeing the flourishing of sociology as a science of society that was regarded as essential for understanding our everyday lives and for a real rebuilding of British society. Community studies came to prominence in an effort to study the new patterns of family and kinship and neighbouring that were thought to be taking place, and they utilised ethnographic techniques of data gathering and participant observation. Now, the role that wives played in those community studies is a significant silence in the face of arguments that social research investigation was on the cusp of an intellectual and methodological transition at the time. It was shifting towards formalized techniques by professionalized social researchers. And as social research was becoming professionalized, so were those incorporated lives of the wives and families of social researchers. Researchers who were undertaking community and family studies, they often lived temporarily in the location that they were studying, and they could be accompanied by wives and children. And Phyllis Wilmot and Pat Marsden both came from working class backgrounds, quite like the communities their husbands were studying. And they kept their diaries in the expectation that the entries would help inform their husbands' analyses. So these diaries show how the wives were co-opted into the academic endeavour. They actively bridged between community and scholarship for their husbands' research because they were embedded in the everyday life of the community under study in a gendered position as mothers of small children, as a wife. And it's clear that the wives weren't just facilitating their husband's community observation. They're undertaking participant observation from a vantage point that was distinct from their husbands. So next slide, please. Phyllis Wilmot's Bethnal Green diary contains very detailed observations of life in the local community and friendships with local mothers. So while Peter Wilmot was organising a general survey of Bethnal Green adults and a subsample of semi-structured interviews with married parents, Phyllis went shopping in the local market. She waited at the school gates with all the other mothers, and then she wrote it all down in her journal. Now, it's clear that the journal observations were kept at the instigation of and for Michael Young, who headed the Institute of Community Studies, where he and Peter Wilmot were working on the Bethnal Green study. So in her personal diary entry for 15th of November, 55, which she kept a separate personal diary as well as the journal. She says, Michael pleased me the other day when he returned the Bethnal Green journal by saying, I like your book very much. It ought to be published in some form one day. The second sentence I cannot take seriously. It was just a job for the Institute and I did it. And when the parts of the journal were indeed published in 2001 in the form of Phyllis's retrospective reflection, Michael Young wrote in the foreword, Phyllis found out and recorded in her journal so much more than we did. Although we had Phyllis's journal at the time of family and kinship, we clearly did not appreciate its full underlying message. Next slide, please. Now, the underlying message, one of them anyway, seems clear in the journal entry for the 22nd of October. Now, the key part of this extract is in bold, where Phyllis is talking about and trying out what's basically involving chatting rather than impartial observing. So she says she's anxious to lean towards being a participator rather than an observer, and it's important to give as well as get. And she goes on to explain how that elicits different sorts of accounts. So in other words, Phyllis Wilmot was pioneering recognition of relationships and reciprocity in social research. And that was a quarter of a century before Anne Oakley wrote her influential chapter on interviewing women as a contradiction in terms, where Anne drew attention to the inability to establish rapport while being distance and objective as an interviewer. More directly, Michael Young and Peter Wilmot couldn't have demonstrated their argument that Bethnal Greeners are surrounded by dense and extensive networks of relatives and acquaintances. They couldn't have done that without Phyllis's contribution. In the book, Family and Kinship in East London, at one point they write, "Let us accompany one of our informants on an ordinary morning's shopping trip." They then list all the people the informant, Mrs. Landon, nodded and chatted to, and they relay verbatim her account of these people's connections to her and the people she knew. And there's a footnote. We are indebted for this account to Phyllis Wilmot. So it was Phyllis who accompanied our informant. It was Phyllis's shopping trips that were professionalised, not just domestic. Next slide, please. Moving on to Pat Marsden, she kept her diary in 2 exercise books that she started after the Marsdens arrived in Salford in August 63. And they came to an end 6 months later at the start of January 64. And the diary material involved these really engaged accounts of Pat's exchanges and friendships with other mothers on the estate, and quite lively descriptions of poor working class children's lives. And Dennis Marsden his detailed notes and research diary contain observations on the Tenants Association and visits to the pub and so on. But Pat has recorded the everyday life in the flats for children and mothers that was happening in the square outside the window of her maisonette. Now, as with Phyllis's diary, Pat's was kept for research purposes. It was kept as a contribution to the ethnographic slum rehousing study, and she was acting as an embedded and reflective participant observer. So when we interviewed her, as you can see, she said the diary was part of the research. She did get involved, but there was always a difference because the people on the estate were living in such extreme poverty. So Pat was also grappling with her insider outsider status as a participant observer. Next slide, please. Now, it's clear that Dennis intended to use Pat's diary in writing up the Salford slum and rehousing study because he made very careful logging about its contents. So using a red pen, he numbered the pages of the diary, and you can see that on the left-hand image. And then in the middle image, again using red pen, he's numbered and listed the main topics covered in Pat's diary. And Pat's diary image on the left also shows the codes written in red pen that Dennis inserted next to most of the people she mentions in her entries. And those codes relate to an index that he typed up, listing names and relationships, which is the image on the right. Now, it's not possible to see traces of Pat's observations in a published version of Salford Slum and Rehousing Study. The research wasn't written up academically because Dennis Marsden took up a lectureship at the University of Essex before the study was completed, and he shifted Pat and the children down south. But nevertheless, the restrictions and the hazards of the built environment that was faced by Pat and other mothers on the estate that she recorded in her diary, they found their way into Dennis's report and recommendations to Salford Housing Department, like lack of outdoor play space, lack of drying facilities for washing, lack of pram spaces, and perilous sharp gravel paths and so on. So, what we've been saying is that there is the appearance of male social researchers producing their foundational sociological insights and achieving academic recognition on their own. But in reality, this was all propped up by input from wives on so many different fronts: domestic, social, administrative, research, publication, and more. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in finding out more about the project and the wives' contributions, we have a very informative website under construction and a very interesting podcast you can sign up to. And also, of course, the film we're going to see next. Now, we didn't plan to have a film from the start. It was Catherine who spotted the potential when she heard about it. And we had no idea what the film would look like, me and Val. it was Catherine's vision for the unique angle on the lives and contributions of wives. So I'm now going to hand over to her to briefly introduce the film, The Sociologist Wives, and to say big thank you for excellent slides. Shifting on to Jen.
Absolutely. Thanks, Roz. So hello, everyone. Firstly, I just want to say how delighted I am to be here. It's a real privilege to be joining you today. And I hope you find the film interesting. And I'm going to take you through. So I'm the director of Popping Orange Communications. I produced and directed the film. I'm just going to let you watch it. And then afterwards, I'll talk you through the sort of processes involved in making it, the kind of decisions we had to make. And then, as Jen said, obviously afterwards, we'll take some questions, which hopefully you'll have some. So yeah, let's just play the film, Jen.
The project came around by serendipity. We were undertaking another project comparing parenting practices in the late 20th century and mid-20th century, and looking through Dennis Marsden's collection at the University of Essex.
And we were looking at a particular study called the Salford Slum Rehousing Study. We started reading the papers and we realised there were references in there to his wife's diary, Pat.
And we just came to realise that she was actually undertaking an ethnographic research project that was facilitating her husband's research. And then we came across mention of Phyllis Wilmot's diaries, and we thought, oh, there's something here.
I'm Sarah, and my mum and dad were Dennis Marsden and Pat Marsden. Pat was a very intelligent person. She was really into research. She was a campaigner. She was a feminist. She was a very strong-minded person, very hard-working.
She came from a very working-class background. She was very intelligent. She could have gone on to get a further education, but her father didn't think girls needed to be educated and wanted her to go out to work.
I think when she was young, there were barriers that were put in place, probably by her dad, I think, who was the main person who stopped her from doing the things that she wanted to do, like go to art school, continue in education. So she always felt a little bit thwarted. My mum and dad met in a jazz club in Huddersfield, and I think meeting my dad was a really big thing for her. So, because he was from a slightly more educated background, and he was probably a little bit different. And they went to live in Salford.
While she and Dennis were living on the Salford housing estate and Dennis was studying it, Pat kept a diary and she recorded everything about everyday working class life on that estate.
I have looked through the diaries and tried to read a little bit, and I think my mum was sort of trying to immerse herself in the culture and what was going on, and I think it looks like to me that it took her a little while to get to know the other mums and, to be acknowledged, because obviously she would have been an outsider.
Her diary was so rich and so detailed and so fascinating, and there was so much observation of the people that lived on the estate around her, and the characters and the children particularly. I mean, she had children in and out of her house.
The children were running around on, it's a big housing estate, and they are running around on a big sort of field in front of the housing estate, and there's like smashed milk bottles and broken glass. They're eating chips all the time, and their clothing is quite poor.
Dennis used her material in reports that he wrote for Salford District Council, the housing department. So she has fed through in those sort of quite undercover ways into his work.
I know that Dennis has read the diaries because it's got little annotations all the way through it, which, I recognise his writing. So he's obviously classifying things. So I've got Pat's CV here, and it does say 1960 to 68. Married and raised 3 children, moved during this period from Yorkshire to Salford. assisted Dennis Marsden in his housing research study in Salford, and after moving to Essex, was sorting out data for his book Mothers Alone. So I think that's proof that she knew she'd contributed. To be honest, I think she was quite quiet about it, so she never really discussed it with us. I never even knew that she'd been so involved, to be honest.
It's much lower key than actually just being able to say, Pat did this, Pat found that, look what that does for British sociology. It doesn't work like that. It's more the intellectual discussion, debate with the husband that then enables the husband to go on and say particular things.
She was never annoyed about it, that she didn't get more of an acknowledgement. I think she probably wouldn't have even expected to have that kind of an acknowledgement because she wasn't an official academic, and she was there to support Dennis, and that may have been enough for her. It wasn't the done thing to be praising people's wives for helping them, and that was just unseen research that was going on. She would have been very happy with the bit at the end that said thank you to my wife Pat.
I am Lewis Wilmot. My mother was Phyllis Wilmot. She was a loving mother to both Mick and myself.
I'm Michael Wilmot. My mother, she came from a working class family in southeast London. Obviously they weren't very well off, and I think that moulded her personality to a certain extent.
And I think that Phil's aim was to move on from that, to try and better herself in a way. Mum met Peter after the war. She trained as an almoner, which is a social worker, and she worked at St Thomas's Hospital. And my dad worked for a Quaker organisation, and I think that Phil went to see Peter at his work about a specific case.
They became interested in each other very quickly, I think.
She actually says, I think I could be happy with this man.
They were perfectly matched. Very early on we moved to Bethnal Green, living above the Institute for Community Studies, which my father had set up with Michael Young, and we lived in the attic there.
I've been up to what was the flat, and it looks out over Bethnal Green. So she had Bethnal Green spread out before her. Phyllis kept two diaries. One was her own personal diary, which is the one where you can imagine her sitting in bed with a fountain pen or a biro, sort of scribbling away in the diary, just actually spilling out all her thoughts. And the other one was a journal of life in Bethnal Green and her observations and so on. Her writing is amazing. She's very honest, and you get a really strong sense of her as a highly intelligent person with really clear intellectual insight, and a very moral person as well.
I think she was very empathetic as well. She obviously built quite authentic connections with the people in Bethnal Green that she lived among.
She and Peter would discuss political and intellectual issues, and they would be debating what the Institute for Community Studies was researching in Bethnal Green.
Phyllis was there, she was at the school gates chatting with the mothers, she was shopping in the local area, she was building connections.
She kept a specific journal that was ready for the Institute to use, and you can see traces of that in the book that they published.
Family and kinship in East London was just such a major study, such an important study in sociology. I think it's probably one of the most famous sociological studies ever done in Britain. And I think it is fair to say that it wouldn't have looked the way that it did without Phyllis's input.
I know there was an influence because they discussed everything. So there was a contribution there from her.
I remember distinctly when the book came out, and Peter and Phil were really excited about that. Look, a book that they had actually worked on for a long time had been published.
It's fair to wonder Would Michael Young and Peter Wilmore have managed to have got that kind of access to working class women's lives if Phyllis hadn't been there building that kind of bridge into the community?
She was a notable diarist, and she kept her diary going for well over half a century. I found myself particularly quoting her in the late 50s, early 60s, which is almost the prime period of that era of British sociology. I mean, after all, you know, Family and Kinship has just been published. Sociology generally is really starting to arrive. And Phyllis had such a lively intelligence, and I'm sure came up with all sorts of ideas. It's inconceivable to me that she didn't. But of course her name wasn't on the books and so on.
She's described as giving sidelights into the area.
My mother, I believe, and it's no more than that, felt her contribution to the work wasn't properly appreciated.
I don't think it was a problem for her. I don't think she felt, because she would have said, you know, she wouldn't have, if she had felt that she was being done down in any way, she would have spoken out.
Michael Young, in a preface to a reflection that she wrote and on her diaries that was published, I think, in the early 2000s, he says that she found out more than they did.
I think she was pleased that that my father and Michael were interested in her viewpoints, and she would have loved to have been acknowledged properly, but I don't think she actually expected it. I think my mother was frustrated by the fact that she stayed at home, as was the norm in those days, and looked after the kids while my father went to work, and I think she'd rather have done more of the work herself. I could feel the frustration in that.
My gut feeling in conversations I had with her in the last 10 years of her life, during her 80s really, is that there was a little bit of bitterness, that she had had this rather remarkable life, and she had been involved with all these predominantly male sociologists at a time when sociology was really the happening thing. I think she felt just a bit under-recognised, yes, actually.
We also decided on Sheila as a case study because she's an enigma. I mean, she was married to two really prominent British sociologists. It's very clear she was instrumental in their intellectual work, in their field work and so on, but we don't know anything about her.
I'm Lucy Jackson and my mum is Sheila Abrams. She was also Sheila Jackson. She's in her late 80s now. She is very proud as a person, very neat, very methodical. She loves people, she loves chatting to people, she loves being with people. She's very into how she looks and being very smart. Mum was born in Huddersfield, in a working class family, in quite a small house, very busy house, one of those houses that had the toilets at the end of the street and a tin bath on a Sunday when you got your wash. Everybody had to do the chores. She went to school, but only until she was 15. She didn't do any qualifications or anything. So my mum went to this jazz club in Huddersfield with her boyfriend at the time. And that's where she met my dad, Brian Jackson. He was really an innovator, an entrepreneur in his own field, and really was one of those forefathers of sociology. Dad came to Cambridge to do his degree, but she wasn't allowed to come to Cambridge and to leave Huddersfield unless they were married. So they got married in Huddersfield and came to Cambridge the same day. For Mum, I think the move was a complete eye-opener. She really liked being with all of Dad's friends that were academics and that knew things.
When she was married to Brian Jackson, he did a lot of working class community studies, and she had ideas for it. She gathered data for it.
Mum, Dad and Dennis Marsden went back up to Huddersfield and went round the working men's clubs, and the three of them went round and did the interviewing. And I think probably having Mum with them probably helped, but she was also very natural at asking the questions and chatting to people.
When it was eventually published as a book, he makes reference to Sheila in the acknowledgements. She doesn't get part authorship, but he says the book probably would not have been written without her. He mentions how she contributed to the field work, to the writing up, and he also thanks her for her selfless encouragement. After the marriage with Brian ended, she then went on to marry another eminent sociologist, Philip Abrams, and they moved up to Durham.
Philip was very different from my dad. He came from a very different background. He was very upper class, and he was very academic.
And then she was involved in another important study on communes.
And she actually went to live in the commune for quite a while. She stayed there, she slept there. So she really did go to quite some lengths to get to know what it was like for the people that she was interviewing, rather than being an outsider looking in.
In the book, Communes, Sociology and Society, in the acknowledgements, she's credited as having the idea for the study in the first place. She's done a lot of the field work. And it's stated in the preface. I think there's a really lovely quote there from Philip Abrams, and he says that Sheila and the other two researchers did the field work while he studied the literature and tried to maintain a proper academic distance from the real world. After the communes research, then Sheila went on to be part of a large major study of neighbouring.
The study of neighbours that, unfortunately, Philip Abrams died before he was able to write it up, but Martin Bulmer, another academic sociology professor, helped write it up, and he fulsomely acknowledges Sheila's role. She was a superb field worker, going out and gathering the data. She was involved in the analysis. In fact, on those projects, she was employed as a researcher, and she was given an office in the department at Durham. Her authorship isn't always recognised, and sometimes it's with Sheila Abrams or Sheila Jackson, which is, I think, unfair and unfortunate.
I think at the time Mum got the recognition she wanted, and she believed for the work she was put in, because she was getting it from the people she was working with. I don't think she ever felt that she was below them, even though they were all academics, or that she was different. I think she felt one of them. But if you looked very coldly at the work, at the books that my dad wrote or that her second husband Philip Abrams wrote, then it doesn't really talk about her very much. So in terms of somebody cold looking at it, you'd say no, the recognition wasn't there. But I don't think she expected it.
There's a distinction there between this idea of intellectual, theoretical work, which is seen as something that the men do, and the more kind of practical field work, which is often what the women do. But of course, you can't have one without the other.
So she was absolutely fundamental to those strands of British sociology.
She is one of the best sociologists that we never knew we had.
The wives weren't recognised, and their value wasn't recognised. And this is what our project's about. It's about uncovering that.
I think I do agree that people like my mum, Pat, was heavily contributing to some of the work that my dad did, even if she didn't realise it herself at the time. You know, it wasn't acknowledged in an academic way.
They did discuss things, and they saw themselves as a pair. They accepted that my father, one, was the driving force, and two, was the one who would go to work, whereas my mother would look after the children. I think she was frustrated by it. I think she was frustrated, which is why she kept her own notes and why she wrote her own thoughts.
For my dad, for Brian Jackson, I think some of his work would have been very different without my mum's contribution, certainly the working class community. For Mum's second husband, Philip Abrams, I think his work would have been incredibly different without Mum's contribution. I don't think it's ever crossed my mind that she should have been recognised more, which feels a bit wrong being a woman. But at the same time, there was that difference between who was the academic and who was taking it and who was, at the time, seen as a supportive role. So I feel very mixed about it in a way.
We mustn't take our contemporary values and expectations and ideas and plonk it on top of what was going on in the 1960s. I think that we can't say, oh, goodness me, they should have, acknowledged their wives, they should have included their wives as co-authors and acknowledged them in more ways.
I think it is really important that sociology as a discipline comes to terms with the significance and the contributions that these wives have made to the discipline. I think it should be acknowledged. There is a discomfort with that figure of the housewife. It's a real anathema, really, to the kind of progressive feminist values that sociology associates itself with. And so there's a sense that housewives didn't really achieve very much. They were just patriarchal dupes. Well, look at how much sociology was actually encompassed in being a housewife.
The argument was that sociologists now need to know about their history of sociology. They need to know whose shoulders they stand upon. And as I read that, I thought, actually, the wives' shoulders were being stood upon too, and they need to be inserted alongside their husbands, not replacing their husbands, but just alongside them in the development of British sociology.
Thanks very much for playing that, Jen. Appreciate that. And just to say that it's very common, actually, that when you play films that are sat on YouTube and then you take them and you play them over Zoom, they can be a bit sticky. So if any of those edits felt a bit jolty to you, it's hard for me as a filmmaker sitting watching them, oh no, it should be smoother than that. It's just simply the technology. So yes, I just wanted to reassure you if that's made me feel better anyway, being able to say that. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed it. Obviously, as Jen said, you can ask me anything and ask Ros and Val anything, obviously for me about the film and obviously for them about the research afterwards. So please do jot down any questions that you've got. And I just wanted to take you through how oh, thanks, Bindi. That was really nice. That was compelling. Oh, lovely. Oh, keep them coming. No, that's great. Thank you. So yeah, if it's useful, I just wanted to talk you through how I got involved and then the various kind of elements of a production that involves very personal stories like that. And also, obviously, the stuff that's relevant to you is turning research into a film and how you can start off believing that it's not a great connection. And actually, hopefully people like me can convince you that actually it's a brilliant way to disseminate and showcase research, because pretty much behind all research in most disciplines, there are human stories. And the reason that a lot of academics do what they do is to inform, affect, and change the world, i.e. the people in it. So people like me can usually keep drilling down and can usually find a human connection and a human story with your research, even where it doesn't normally or doesn't very naturally seem possible right at the start. So let me take you through our sort of production process. So as Ros mentioned, and I must thank them for allowing me to get involved, both Ros and Val, I came to know about the project when they decided they wanted a podcast initially. And I do some production work and some presenting for a company called Research Podcasts that makes podcasts with and for academics and members of the research community. And my colleague, Christine, who started telling me about this project that Ros and Val were doing, and I knew Ros, I'd worked with her on another project, so I knew she looked at great stuff. And as she started telling me, oh, they're uncovering the hidden contributions of housewives in the 50s and 60s that they made to their academic husband's work. And straight away, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, because I found myself picturing these women. I found myself imagining their home lives, their marriages, their lives, the society around them. We're talking about the era of my grandparents, to whom I was really close. And so, I started picturing it. I wanted to know straight away, wanted to find out more about these women, and I wanted to be a part of bringing their stories to life. Personally, I'm really fascinated. I'm a wife, I'm a mum, I'm a daughter, a granddaughter, an aunt. I'm really fascinated about the changing roles and circumstances of women in the last century, the various sort of demands on our lives, the societal expectations, the way those demands have kind of been managed and handled and shifted over the years. So that's a sort of personal fascination for me anyway. And of course, I'm a filmmaker. So for me, this was, if you like, the perfect marriage of a project. So Ros and I and Val started talking, and we were very clear right from the start, actually, that there was little point making outputs that just said the same thing all the time. And we knew that the podcast was going to be reasonably academic in focus. And so what I felt really strongly about is that this film should step back from the sort of the academia of the project and the sort of academic nature of it, and just celebrate these women. And in order to do that, to kind of find out who these women were and to talk to people who knew them, loved them, remembered them, because unfortunately 2 of the 3 women are no longer with us. We lost Pat really recently, and one of the women wasn't in a position to be interviewed. So we knew it would have to come from sort of first-hand accounts, if you like, from people who knew them, and who better than their children. And we referred to these people as the children all the way through the film, which of course is ridiculous when they are all, middle-aged. But they were the children to us, and they always will be. So we knew that if we could track and get the children to agree to be interviewed, then we would potentially have a film. I think also as a filmmaker, the first thing is you can have a great story, but you think, right, what am I going to show? We can talk about this, but what am I actually going to show people? And obviously, if you're telling, stories of the lives of people, then you're going to want to see photos of them from the era in which we are talking about, the work that they did. But, it's also what else am I going to see? And obviously with Phyllis and with Pat, we knew we had diaries. And straight away, I think we'd all agree, diaries are a really meaningful, tangible artifact. And Ros did give me a lovely quote in her interview, which sadly didn't make the final cut, about how when you hold the diary, a handwritten diary of somebody, you straight away feel a connection to them, and you feel that you know them a little bit, particularly, when you read their writing as well. And although through a film, I can't let you touch those pages, hopefully the way we shot them and the way we use them in the edit, you got a sense of just how powerful they were, and just as a document of that era as much as of anything else. So we knew we had the diaries, and we thought if we can get interviews as well from people who wouldn't normally be talking about these women, their mothers, then we were onto something. So that's what we set about doing. So the first thing to do was to sort of think about who we already had access to. And brilliantly, Ros and Val had already made some connections with some of the children of the women to say, look, we're doing this project, would you like to be involved? And they sort of had that to a varying degree of success, I suspect, because it was a matter of interest rather than a specific request. So when I started emailing the children, but I had a specific request, which is, we're going to make a film. We'd love you to be part of it. We'd love you to be involved. How about we have a chat? I think that was something potentially a little bit more tangible for them to grab hold of and say yes or no to. And one thing that, we knew that experience sort of taught me would absolutely be the case is that this would not be a film we could make overnight, that this would take a lot of time. And, thanks to Ros and Val for not imposing a really strict deadline of when this film needed to be ready, we recognized really early on this was going to take time, because what was going to be crucial was making contact with those that we wanted to feature, but also gaining their trust and being able to reassure them of the film we wanted to make, which wasn't going to delve into anyone's personal lives, wasn't going to delve into whether marriages had succeeded or failed, wasn't going to, delve into their own childhoods. And I think really importantly, wasn't going to be what I came to kind of informally refer to it as a man-bashing film. We are not here to say, or this film was never intended to say, look at these dreadful men who did all this work and took all this credit. Particularly, I mean, that's not my view anyway, but given that we were talking to their children, I very quickly wanted to reassure them that that was not the case, that we were not taking anything away, or even trying to suggest that anything be taken away from the achievements of these men, but instead to put the wives alongside their contributions and to make them part of their valuable contributions. And I think it was in one of our meetings that we had where Ros said the beautiful quote about on whose shoulders sociologists of today stand. And that really stuck with me, that as well as standing on the shoulders of these men, we should also be standing, or you should also be standing on the shoulders of the women. And that's, I use that to explain to the children what it was we were trying to get at. And so the kind of production process was, it stretched over months, and it involved reaching out to the people that we wanted to feature, allowing them space to come back. So really in that initial email, all I did was introduce myself and my company, introduce Ros and Val, and obviously Ros and Val were known to some of the people anyway, and to just say, listen, we're thinking of making a film. We'd love to make a film. How would you feel about having a chat with me about it? And really at that point, asking no more of them. As I say, we're very mindful right from the get-go that these are people's private lives, people's private stories. Some of the losses experienced were really recent, and I just wanted to be, and was very naturally mindful of that throughout the whole thing. We decided we wanted to focus on 3 women. As you can tell from Ros's presentation, there are many more women that we could have featured, but as anybody who's sort of worked in communications would know, the best thing to do is to pick some stories and tell them well, as opposed to trying to stretch a number of stories across a film of a similar duration. That being because what you would do is dilute that message. Whereas if you tell 3 stories and tell them really well, that you're doing much more justice to the overall cause than if you start to dilute and spread more stories a bit too thinly. So we focused on Phyllis and Pat and Sheila, and decided we would tell their stories really well. Of course, just before I move on to sort of dealing with the children, when you think about the various different ways you can produce a film like this, we could have used a narrator. Another way of doing this, if, for example, the children hadn't wanted to be involved, which I think would have cast a very different shadow over the film anyway, because it's something that I think if you're telling people's personal stories, you would want to think you had the family's buy-in. And I think I'd have felt very awkward and potentially wouldn't have done it if we didn't have the family's buy-in. But say we did have their buy-in, but they didn't want to be on camera, which of course is really possible. Many, many people, for completely justifiable reasons, do not want to be on camera. We could have used a narrator, but I felt very strongly that the stories of these women really needed to be told by those who knew them and were close to them. So that is why we began to go in the direction that we wanted to go in. I think as a filmmaker, what I basically got exactly what I wanted with this film, in that we did get all the children to say yes. I don't think I would have necessarily put money on that at the start, because I do feel incredibly lucky that all of them did agree to be in it. It was so important to me that they did, both from an ethical point of view, and as we just said about, it would be a very awkward and difficult film to make if we didn't think we had their buy-in. But in terms of them being on the camera, the thought of sitting down and speaking to these people was something that I was really excited by. I think as a filmmaker, there's something very intimate and very special about watching people as they remember and as they share memories, or as they try to express an opinion, to either watch their face light up or cloud over. When you're interviewing people about something in the past and you see them pause, you know that what's going on in their mind is they're going back in time, and there's a picture going on in their minds, and then they're going to try and share that picture with us. And it's really real and it's really compelling. And so I was very excited about the prospect of getting family members of these women in front of the camera. So obviously, to sort of go back to the nuts and bolts of it and the production process, I started off, as I say, by emailing them and waiting for them to come back. I think very few of them, I mean, it feels like a long time ago now, but I think very few of them got straight back to me. Often I would just have to leave it a certain amount of time, then drop them another gentle 9 to just say, not sure if you received this email, but I'd still really love to have a chat. And slowly people started getting back to me. And there was a whole range, as there always is, as you will know, of reasons why people don't get back to you straight away. Sometimes it's because they're mulling it over. Sometimes they're not sure if it's genuine. Sometimes it's just that their schedule is really busy and they haven't had time to get back. And so sort of one by one, they started to come back. And one by one, I spent time chatting to them, often over Zoom, sometimes face-to-face, where possible, face-to-face. There was a very funny story about Sarah, Pat's daughter. So Roz and Val had contact with Pat's son, and I started off by talking to him. He was absolutely lovely, but he was based in Aberdeen. I'm not, I'm based down in Essex. And so we were thinking, right, okay, logistically, how are we going to do this? Because he was very up for being interviewed. It'd taken a while to reach out to him and him come back to me, but their grief was very recent. And so he'd given it a lot of thought, which obviously I totally respected and appreciated. But anyway, whilst we were trying to work out, if going up to Aberdeen was a possibility in terms of budget and time, he mentioned his sister, Sarah. And when I said, where does Sarah live? Turns out Sarah lives in the same village I live. And all along, while I've been trying to track him down, I'd probably been in the co-op with Sarah. I mean, that's probably what it's come down to. It's not a massive village. I'd probably shared space with this woman that I was, inadvertently trying to track down. So anyway, that is all to say that it took a long time to track them, to talk to them, to start saying, to sort of dump on them, really. This is what we'd like to do. Why don't you go away and think about it and see if it's something you'd like to be involved in? Sheila is still with us. So Lucy, her daughter, was very clear that she wanted to speak directly to Sheila about it, that she didn't feel that she was up to being interviewed, but that she would certainly want to be involved. And Lucy didn't want to be involved until she'd sort of cleared it with Sheila. So of course, all of this takes time, and enabling the production process to breathe like that is sometimes so important. So I would urge anyone who has an inkling that they might like to make a film about their research or an element of their research to just bear that in mind and leave as much run-up time as you can possibly leave, because these are human lives, and we're all leading very busy lives, and these things take time. So as we started to hear back from people, and as we started to have chats, and people started to say, yes, absolutely, I'm happy to be interviewed, I then went to Churchill Archives with Roz and Val and actually met, if you like, Phyllis's diaries for the first time. And then I very much knew that if her sons, Michael and Lewis, did agree to be interviewed, I'd very much want to interview them there with the diaries. They hadn't been that aware of the diaries, and they certainly hadn't been to the archives, although they very much knew they were there and were very, behind Phyllis's decision to put them there. And obviously, as you can see, very proud of their mum. They'd never actually gone to Churchill Archives. So I felt like that's great. As a filmmaker, I get that first as well, seeing them flick through. And I don't know if you clocked in the film, but the drawing that Lewis flicks through is one that we found tucked in Phyllis's diary. And that was one that he did as a child. So, just to watch him kind of touch that he probably hadn't touched for what, 50 years maybe. You know, just moments like that are for me, you know, what it's all about. So we started then to think about pulling this all together. So they were all based in different areas of the country. And I think, you know, as you can well imagine, every film has a budget, and you can spend that budget in various different ways. I always like to do less and do that well than try and spread the resource too thinly. So I knew I wanted these interviews to feel very warm, very intimate, very comfortable, very cozy, because we're talking about sensitive stuff. We're talking about personal relationships. So I knew that I wanted, you know, a lighting camera operative who would set that scene nicely for me. And so it was a case of being able to access Roz, Val in a place where we could conduct lovely interviews with them, where there wouldn't be someone drilling outside and there wouldn't be a dog barking in the next room, and all of these logistical things. And then also for each of the children as well. And also to try and put as much in one filming day as possible. So having hired a top camera operative, you want to cram as much as you can into that day to make sure that you get good value for money. So we mixed around, and in the end, we shot the whole thing in 2.5 days, which I'm actually really proud of. And it's testament to everybody being really flexible as well with their diaries. One of the children flew in from abroad. They now live abroad. They came over for us. So it was a real team effort to kind of pull it all together. And in terms of, so obviously I chatted to them about what the film was about and the types of things I would be asking. And in fact, when with Lucy wanting to talk things through with Sheila, I sent her the questions way in advance so she could actually go through them with Sheila. And actually, I think it led to a really lovely conversation between them, you know, totally irrespective of the film. And apparently Sheila just kept saying, I just don't know why they're interested. I just don't know why they want to know about me and what I did, which, you know, I think is staggering when you hear about what she did. But I think totally fits with, you know, what Lucy ended up saying about how she feels slightly conflicted, that, and I love that bit. I love that quote. And I love the fact that she was so candid about it, that, you know, on the one hand, particularly as she says, as a woman, she looks at it and thinks, you know, I would really love to, you know, I would love to celebrate this. And of course, this needs recognizing. But on the other hand, she knew that really her mum was just there to support her, was supporting her dad and was doing it because she totally believed in him and his work. And I think, you know, that juxtaposition is really lovely. So anyway, so I did give them the questions in advance. I always, when I do give questions in advance, I always say, you know, I know you want to prepare, but please don't script. So whether we are podcasting or filmmaking, we always say, please don't script answers. And that is because people will then be tempted to read those answers. And I think if you're reading straight away, you're a little bit stripped of your authenticity if you're being asked for first-hand accounts. Obviously, presentations and research is different. But if you're sitting down asking for, you know, personal accounts and you feel they're being read, I think straight away you lose a little bit of the intimacy and a little bit of the genuine nature there. And they all took that on board really well. I did want to give them some prep. You know, it's one of those things where if somebody's asking you big questions, it's nice to have had space and time to think about what the answers to that, you know, really is. And I like to think we gave them that. And I think when I sat down to interview them, there weren't that many surprises. I think by the time I sat down to interview the children, I pretty much knew what they were going to say. There was sort of more colour that they'd thought about and taken the time to think about. And they'd sort of really dredged their own memories, because in the initial conversations, they were like, oh, I don't really remember Mum keeping a diary. And well, it's funny you should say that, but I can't think when she did that. Maybe she did it when we were in bed. I think it was Lewis who said, maybe she just wrote all that when we were in bed, you know. And so it was really sort of evoking in them a desire to look back and think it through. And so because we'd had all the conversations we'd had, there weren't that many surprises. In terms of sort of editorial judgments I made ahead of the filming, I knew very clearly that I wanted to interview the two brothers, Lewis and Michael, separately. because they were both fantastic and they both had brilliant things to say. And I knew they slightly differed in how they remembered things. Both extremely clear on the you know, the power of their parents' marriage, and how it was such a lively household with everything being spoken about all the time, and very clear on their mum's influence. But there were elements where they disagreed slightly, and I thought if I interview them together, I will lose the power of that, because they will kind of cancel each other out. Whereas if I interview them separately, each will get their own space to talk freely about how they see it and how they remember it. So definitely made that call. I did sometimes think about getting all the children together, but again, I just felt that although there were so many similarities between all of these women, they were 3 individual stories. And so again, to kind of do less and to do it well, you know, it would be better to interview them separately. So, but just to kind of give you an insight into the types of decisions that you have to make, you know, what you're going to ask them, but also how you're going to ask them, what situation you're going to put them in order to ask them, how you want it to look, how you want it to feel. Even little tiny things like, you know, for an intimate interview like this, or like we've included in that film, you wouldn't sit somebody on a stool. Okay, for obvious reasons, they would be wobbling about, they wouldn't look comfortable, they wouldn't look at ease, and that would come across in then how they delivered things. So there is a lot of thought that goes into the sort of scene setting, and it's not scene setting to change the meaning of anything or to skew anything. It is simply to create the right environment for people to share the stories, because if they don't feel comfortable, they won't share the story properly, and they might leave having not said what they wanted to say. And then my duty of care to them, I would have failed. You know, once I've got them on board, my duty of care to them is to give them the space to tell their story in the way they want to tell it. So there are lots of little things that you kind of think about along the way to, you know, to make sure that that happens. So David Kynaston, you might think slight outlier there. He's not a child. He's not an academic on the project. We felt really strongly, it was actually Lewis that put me on to David Kynaston. And that's the wonderful thing about how these films come about. You start off with 4 names, right? I want to contact this person, and this person. And of course, in talking to them, they go, you should speak to X, or you should speak to Y. And that is how your research just suddenly starts to take over, or take off, should I say. And Lewis was very clear that he felt that David had really championed Phyllis's work. He's basically taken, I mean, you probably know this, I was new to David's work. For those of you that do know, you'll know that he's broken up, he's taken the post-war sort of British history and broken it up into chunks of years and written a book about each. And he'd very heavily quoted Phyllis, as he talks about in the film. And so I thought that was important to have him in there. And I also thought we also did sort of a broader interview as well about sort of society in that time, and what marriages were like in that time, and what was expected of marriages. And actually, had the film had been a longer film and with a slightly broader narrative, that would have been of value. And so that does exist. And David is a fantastic interviewee. But yes, so that's to explain why he's in there, and also how your research can just grow and grow and grow. So once we'd done all the interviews and all the contributors, I think you agree, were amazing. I felt so privileged that they felt comfortable enough to share their stories, and that also I think the realizations they'd come to, having gone through the process of preparing to be interviewed by us, and then to kind of watch it back. And then, of course, you go into the edit, and you go into the edit with hours and hours of beautiful material, knowing that actually, although we hadn't got a set duration for the film, you know, we know that people aren't going to sit for hours and hours and hours and watch something. So we had to sort of set it to a time frame that effectively enabled us to tell the 3 stories, but that also didn't make those stories go on and on and on and on to a point where people might dip out. So again, you know, as in any communications work, just making sure that you hit that sweet spot in terms of duration. And I hope you feel we did that. So there's a wealth of material to go through. The only way I felt was right to do it was to transcribe each and every interview, which I did, because I knew it would be a case of reaching in to those interviews and pulling out the salient points. We weren't going to be able to just take chunks and lay them all together. It was going to have to be much more nuanced than that. So that's what we did. We sort of pulled out the narrative and, you know, remained respectful of any sensitivities, and then just started to cut it down. But whilst cutting it down, just remaining mindful of the sort of aspect of filmmaking that I talked about at the beginning, which is when people share their story and they make a point or they share a memory, it's really important to let that land. And I literally mean land. So we hear it and we just take a moment and go, oh, you know, like that. You want to give as a filmmaker, you need to give your viewer the chance to do that. And I hope you'll agree we did do that. It's very tempting when you sort of think, right, I'd really like this film to be around 20 minutes and it's 19:30 and you want to cut it really hard to try and get it all in. But actually, again, you're just not doing the content a service if you do that. You have to let stories breathe. And again, I hope you feel that we did that, but, you know, bit of a sort of a top tip there. Music is obviously really important as well. Choosing the right music. We did have a bit of a faux pas with because the couple had met in the jazz club, we thought it'd be really nice to have some jazz music. And in an initial cut, that music went on far too long. And so what we ended up with was someone sharing quite a sensitive memory with some jazz music, you know, plonking along in the background, and it just killed it, you know. So again, you straight away, you know, right, that music's got to come out before then, and we've got to be back to music that's far more fitting with what is being talked about. So there's so much trial and error in the editing process. I had a fantastic editor, a guy called David McSkimming, who I work with a lot, who did a sterling job, cared about these women and their stories as much, if not more, if that's possible, than I did, which is so important because then it's a shared process. Editorially, it's a shared process rather than someone just, you know, putting shots, you know, experimenting with where different shots go. So I must say a big thank you to him as well. And then, of course, you have your finished version, and it's sort of the biggest moment, I think, as a filmmaker. It's the moment when it stops being your baby and you have to send it out to those involved, on camera, off camera, and you send it and you wait. And it's the longest wait. And then bit by bit, people start to get back, and the first person likes it. And then, you know, and they start to come in, and I'm delighted to say that they all liked it. They felt that that they had done justice. You know, a few of them were really nervous about being interviewed, weren't sure they themselves would do justice to the memories and the stories, and they were pleased to see that they felt they had, and that they'd been brave enough to do it, and they were really pleased with how the stories had come out in the final film. And then, you know, the mission is to share it far and wide and to celebrate these women and get the world to watch this film, so that these stories, you know, remain documented and remain there for many people to enjoy. So that was the production process. Obviously, in the Q&A, ask me anything you like, if there's anything that I've sort of left out that you'd like to know about. And also, I just wanted to just urge you with your own research to just think about whether any of it could lend itself to a film. I will always say it probably could, and it might not be, you know, the first thing that, you know, in your packed schedules and sort of dissemination schedule you would naturally think about, but I would urge you to do that. So yeah, thanks very much for your time. I'll hand back to you, Jen.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. I think we've had a really impressive hour and 20 minutes so far, where we've gone through the details of the project and then the key output from the project that we're discussing today. Yes, very much, Barbara. A round of applause for everyone. That was absolutely superb. And now how's how into the creation of the output. So now it's just questions. So I don't know if Ros and Val, you'd like to put your videos back on so that you can also be asked questions. So if you've got any questions at all for any of the speakers, now's the time. We've got 40 minutes scheduled, but please don't feel that we have to fill that. There would be nice to get some questions going. And before I hand over for questions, a reminder that this recording will be available on the BSA website for attendees. So please feel free to revisit as well. So are there any questions from the audience, or am I going to be able to take chair's privilege and ask the first question? in that case, I will take chair's privilege. I've got a question for Ros and Val first, if that's all right. Because I was really interested in what you said, Ros, in the video about not applying today's moral standards or feminist viewpoints to things that happened before. But then the other half of me was like, but lots of feminist literature was coming out then about women's roles and the amount of work women were doing and the double shift and domestic labour and sexual labour. So I just wondered if we didn't need to necessarily apply our contemporary views back, maybe just other sociologist views of the time. It's interesting that that wasn't sort of picked up on by these sort of leading male sociologists. And then after that, we'll come to Caroline, your question.
Yeah, that is a knotty point there. I think it's I think if you say I didn't want to sort of do the guys down, and I didn't want to do their wives down, like Val was saying about, you know, just thinking of them as patriarchal dupes. So that was part of avoiding that. But I think Val probably has thought about this a bit more than me.
I'm not sure I have really. I'm almost not sure what the point is really, because it was in the past, in terms of, and there's so much to do now. It's almost like looking back and having all that kind of debate around, well, should these men have been more whatever, it just, I'm not sure. I don't think they were, and I think you can see that from they honestly, it didn't occur to them. I just don't think it did, and I don't even think it occurred to their wives in a lot of cases. They weren't there, kind of. They just assumed that this is how it should be. We are talking about the 50s, and it was a very different time. So yeah, I think that's what I'd say. I think I'm more concerned about where we are now and how we look at the past, and how we make sense of it now. And and I think that concerns me, the way that women of the past do tend to be kind of seen as not having achieved anything. And that sort of lack of ability to recognize that now, I think that sort of speaks to something that's quite problematic. It's almost like it's like that cycle that somehow it's women of the past they're always seen as having failed in a sense, and it's women of the future are the progressive ones, and they're going to change everything, and then until they don't, and then they're women of the past again, and it just seems to be a cycle. So I think it's more important to recognize the achievements of the women of the past than actually have these arguments about what the men should or shouldn't have done at the time. We've got, we should have the arguments about what men now should or shouldn't do, I think.
Have we got any other questions? We have, yeah, Vivian.
Okay, thank you so much. It was really very insightful and very interesting. I just wanted to share some thoughts or ideas that when at the beginning, when I saw the film, as Catherine said, that the value of their interviews and their history and how they have contributed. But then I just kept myself saying that, yes, but why not recognized? Because, when you're getting involved, surely you want to contribute, or you're learning from your husband who is academic. But then there is always something that your part is not always recognized. And I was wondering to what extent the fact that women sociologists historically have been their work have been recognized quite very late, and they appear in the scene very late. So in a way, I could, let's say, analyze the film as also a continuous from that history, and probably now the future that, okay, women can be recognized, as is the case for for Philip Abrams, when that she got it, she could recognize at the end. So that's I mean, I had this question that while I could see the value of the interviews as such, which are really very, very important, that's the first time we could see it in the film, but at the same time, it's this historical background that make us feel, yes, but what about, I mean, the equal, let's say, contribution to men and women sociologists in that? That's my comment. Thank you.
Well, I suppose Catherine made the point about the film, which you might like to comment on again, which is that you can't have it. You can't have everything in there, that you need to focus down. And it's the same about research projects and the limited amount of time and funding we have. I think, yeah, as Val said, it's just enormous where you could go with this. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to pick up what I think, hearing some of the questions, I've been reminded again of something, and again, you can't put it all in the film, but that Lucy said about when they were going, when her mum went with Brian Jackson and Dennis Marsden to the Working Men's Club, and she said, this to interview the people there, and she said, this was at a time when women weren't even allowed at the bar in a Working Men's Club, let alone to just go and start talking to people in there. And she sort of said that with a twinkle, as in, it would have, she said something like, I'm sure it would have helped that there was a beautiful blonde woman with them, drawing attention, etc., which was a lovely comment. So I think, that's the case, but also it's that thing of, as Ros said, about it's always better to tell a story well and keep that really focused and hope that leads to further discussion. I think we've all been at things, whether they're presentations or films or podcasts or whatever, where too much has been tried to cram in and we come away not really having clung to anything. So I think the skill is trying to tell lesser, fewer stories well, and then if they raise questions and further debate, all for the good, and then maybe that is a different output on its own.
I think there's many more stories to be told. I think that's the that's the key message.
Thank you very much for that. Are there any further questions from? I suppose we've had so much information that part of this is just nice to sort of sit and think about what we've just learned, especially given that it was sort of the ordering that it's been delivered in. Like, I kind of keep on trying to formulate a question on how you make a film, and then that somehow draws back to a question about creating the research and the projects, and then trying to make it coherent so that I can ask the question is beyond the grasps of my capacity at the moment. We just enjoyed it all so much. Would anyone are there any questions particularly about the making of the output? As Catherine's here, that it's quite an unusual panel that we've got, in that we've got someone here who's sort of been central in making the video rather than talking about a video that has been made. No one?
I saw that there in the comments earlier on, there was some sort of exchanges about the funding.
Oh yes, about archive, accessing archival documents. That would be great if you could speak to that.
So I think Catherine might want to say maybe we were lucky. We got funded by the archive, not
So the budget, there is no such thing, well, not in the way I work anyway, as one, a film like that will cost you this, because it's so dependent on where you're having to travel to film, what else you're going to have to pay for alongside it. I think the point that someone made in the chat is that archive itself costs money. So for example, we looked for moving footage of Bethnal Green in the 1960s. Not only could I not really find what I was after, but I sort of knew in the back of my mind that even if I could find it, the budget probably wouldn't stretch to it. So you do generally have to pay for archive. There is some free archive out there, but it's a job on its own. There, productions do have archive researchers. We didn't. And I would say it wasn't necessary for this, but the budget would not have stretched to that. But television programs would have archive researchers for whom it is a particular skill. They know, you know, who has access to what and what someone's going to charge per second for you to show that. So I think it's always tempting to go for moving footage. I find stills, photographs, really emotive. And actually pretty much all of the photos that we used in that film were either from the children themselves literally bringing their family album in, or from stills that Ros and Val already had, or that Churchill Archives had in Cambridge that, you know, they were happy for us to use. So, you know, just a bit of a health warning that any imagery you do use, you do have to clear the copyright for. So you either have to make sure that the person giving it to you has the copyright and has the power, if you like, to give it to you and say that it can be used, or that, you know, it has to have exceeded copyright either because of its age or whatever. So, you know, that goes for imagery and that goes for music. So it really isn't just as simple as seeing a photo that you like online, grabbing that, picking your latest favorite commercial track. I'm sure you all know this, but just to kind of reiterate, it's really important that, you know, you have to pay copyright for all of these things. And actually all the music that I used in that film, and I use in all my films pretty much, is rights-free music. So there are plenty of what we call rights-free libraries out there that musicians contribute to, on the understanding that, you know, the license agreement is such that they do the music for that company, and then you can, as a filmmaker or podcast producer or whatever, you can download it and use it free of charge. That is the deal. And, you know, I think the music in that film is lovely, and yeah, it was all rights-free music. So yeah, so you can get around all these things, but absolutely right to note that, yeah, if you're going to use imagery, it is going to cost you, or at the very least, you're going to have to find out what the license agreement is.
Thank you, that's great. We've got a couple of questions from Riaz Timol, who sounds like they're doing fascinating and complementary research on the experience of wives of imams in Cardiff. So the second question, which is a bit quicker, is will there be any academic outputs or journal articles, because they'd like to cite, which makes a lot of sense given the nature of their study. So I suppose that's a quick one to Ros and Val before we move on to the bigger question of, did you have to build the budget for the film into the research proposal from the outset, or did the idea for the film come about after?
Yes, so yes, we have got an article that's supposed to be appearing in Serendipity journal, and I will, over the summer, Val and I will get together and write another article. So yeah, but there is something that's supposed to be forthcoming in Serendipity, which is just a similar coverage as what I talked about. In terms of the budget, the best thing to do is to cost it in. But I think, as I indicated, we didn't even know that we were going to be making a film, so none of this was costed in. So what this involved was metaphorically running around, grabbing bits of money from different places. So we had some budget in the British Academy and Leverhulme funding. Churchill Archive put some money in because they wanted to promote the fact that Phyllis Wilmot's work was at their archive, and yes, pinching it, I think, from various other sources.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to come in on that and just say, as Ros says, the really important takeaway is that if you can, then write it in right at the start. And that sort of ties in with, if you have an idea that you might like to do a film as part of your research, is to have those conversations with people like me really early on. You don't need to know how it's going to come about, and you don't need to know who it's going to feature and what it's going to involve. That's the job of people like me. But just reach out and have that initial conversation and see if someone like me can help you bring it to life. You don't have to do that legwork, but you just have to kind of leave yourself the time, and then, as Rod said, the budget to be able to do that.
That's fantastic. Okay, have we got any final questions from the audience? Oh, in that case, I think everyone has gained an extra 15 minutes to reflect on the film, perhaps watch it again. I know I've watched it quite a few times, and I still find something new when I watch it again. So I'm delighted that it's on this open access forum, so we can watch it. And for those that don't know, I added it to the chat at the very beginning, but I'll add it again now. So you've got the link for the film there again. And otherwise, all that's left to say is thank you so much, Ros, Val, and Catherine. It's been such a fantastic session. Been absolutely delighted to chair it, and it's been an absolute pleasure. So yes, and thank you very much for everyone for attending. And please do remember that the video will be available on the BSA website for attendees.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.